And welcome to these sessions for the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno, these virtual sessions as we celebrate the Centennial of Portuguese radio in California. It was precisely on a Thursday, June 10th of 1920, that a gentleman by the name of José Vitorino, whom we found out from an interview done 44 years ago by Euclides Álvares with Mr. Frank Mendonça, that José Vitorino was illiterate, did not know how to read or write, and began the very first Portuguese radio program in California out of the Stockton Modesto area, KBMC radio station. Just the year that radio stations began here in the United States as well. We have with us José Rodrigues, who is from Northern California and who has been also himself involved in radio. José Rodrigues, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this virtual session. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for inviting me. I am very good.
Let's talk about Portuguese radio. I know that you've done some research. I know that you, by the way, for those of you who don't know, José Rodrigues has been involved in the Portuguese Heritage Publications of California since its inception. And one of the last publications he was co-authored, which was Untamed Dreams. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have the book in front of me, but right.
That's correct.
Correct, good. So tell me a little bit, I know that you were an immigrant from the Azores, from the island of San Miguel, and how did, when you came to California, you've gotten involved in radio somewhat. Tell us a little bit about that trajectory.
I had, like many of us in the Azores, family in California, and my uncle visited Loma de Mayo in 1962. At that time, I was attending Liceu Nacional Intercantal in Ponta Delgada. And he said, well, why don't you come to the United States as a student? So in 1963, I got a visa to come to the United States to study electronic engineering. And he lived in San Rafael. His name was Agnel Clementino. And he had started a radio program in San Rafael, at that time called Voz da Colônia Portuguesa. So in 1963, when I arrived, he started asking me to collaborate a few things, and very soon I was doing a lot of, he had an hour program daily out of an AM station in San Francisco. I was going to school and also doing the news in Portuguese, because at that time, obviously, the community, there was a lot of people that did not speak English yet. So I would record the news, national and international, about a 10 to 15-minute program, and then go to school.
How did you get the news? I'm curious, José. How was it? Was it the easiest thing in the world to get news? And was it in English and you had to translate it to Portuguese, or how was it?
It was, the news that I got internationally were in English. I would listen to the American radio. And then at that time, there was an agency in Portugal called ANI, Agência Nacional de Informação, that would send, oh my God, I never forget those onion skin paper in orange. The news from Portugal, usually 2 weeks, 3 weeks old. And of course, always started with somebody opening cutting the ribbon for some bridge or something. And out of that, we got a few things. And that was also the component.
So your uncle's program, Mr. Agnel Clementino, was a daily show, which is, I didn't know that. I thought it was a weekly show.
Yes, it was daily. It was daily out of an AM station in San Francisco.
And so at that time, in the 1960s, of course, Mr. Clementino had his radio show, and others did too. It seemed like from the research that Dr. Mayan Diaz did and everything else, that the 1960s and 70s were basically very important for Portuguese radio. It was an important part of the community.
Well, there was a confluence of events. First, obviously, was the arrival of a very large group of immigrants that spoke no English. Number two is the advent of the FM stations. At that time, in 1960s, you couldn't get an FM station on the radio. There wasn't such a thing yet. So, and there was the golden period of television. So radio was a medium with a lot of time that was not necessary, let's say it. So the people that owned it, they would rent the hour to foreign language or religious or whatever. And so it was ideal.
So your uncle rented the hour, basically brokered the hour and got his own ads and everything else.
Absolutely. And it also shows the quality of the ads. I mean, today you listen to Portuguese radio stations, you get the Portuguese store, the bakery, and blah, blah. At that time, because I prepared the invoices for advertising, because the invoices for advertising at that time also had to be notarized to the agency. We had Pan American, Budweiser, Leg&Loaf Bread, Swiss Air. It was all big companies.
Wow.
That were looking for a market. That's how it was quite nice.
Now, did he like others? Did he basically radio was his life, or did he do something else professionally and radio was a part-time?
Radio was his life, because around the radio, he started also the movies, bringing movies, which usually was about 4 or 5 movies a year that were shown. The northest point we went to the movies, it was Lincoln by Sacramento, all the way to San Diego, but usually Tulare was the bottom one on the old theater, which was great. You couldn't do it today, because in the old theater in Tulare, I believe, took over 900 people. Now they divide them in all the screens. And at the same time, he also started a little mid-60s, bringing Portuguese artists, stage artists, Amalia, Tony Mourão, all these people. And those were about 4 or 5 also a year.
How long did he keep his program? So he had begun, you said you arrived in 1963, he had begun the program shortly before then?
Yes, he started in 40, 50. He was in a program for 30 years.
30 years, okay.
30 years.
So yeah. He continued until the 70s? Yes,
he continued the 70s. Then, the radio got more complicated, and he developed an acute asthma problem, and then he couldn't handle the speaking.
Well, you been in the Bay Area all of your life since '63, so it's been a while. And besides, of course, the contact with your uncle Agnello Clementino, a true pioneer, you kind of been able to listen to and see radio throughout the years. Other than Agnello Clementino, what's a couple other names or that you recall of that era? I'm not talking about the professionalization, but a couple other names or any other names that you recall that were kind of icons, as Agnello Clementino was in the Portuguese radio world in the 60s and 70s and even 80s.
Well, see, Joaquim Esteves, Celeste Ávila, Maria Cabral had a radio program for many years. Luizinho Costa, Medeiros. Eu posso dizer que na Califórnia, porque a gente mandava os I just changed languages.
That's right, we do that.
In California, because we had to send the invitations to the shows and the movies and all that to the colleagues in the radio, my list was 56 Portuguese radio programs.
Wow.
With the southernmost being o Goulart de San Diego.
Paul
Goulart was at that time was from the station in Tijuana.
That's right. Yes, I recall that as well when I got here.
That's right.
And of course, a lot of these people, and especially the ones from the 60s and the 70s, I think radio changed immensely in the 1980s. But the 60s and the 70s, they had a prominent place in the Portuguese American community. I mean, people looked up to the radio personalities of the 1960s and 70s. That's how
Yeah.
I felt when I got here. I mean, it was a big deal to know in Tulare, for example, Hanford, Visalia, this area. It was a big deal to know and to be friends with Joaquin and Amelia Morrison,
Yes,
with the Inácio dos Santos Pisca. I mean, they were cultural icons.
absolutely. And there was a reason. And it is simple. First of all, they would become like the movie stars, important. And at that time, believe it or not, the radio programs had clubs, like fan clubs. My uncle had like 14 of them, which met every month. And the people were members and they played cards themselves. They enjoyed it. But then they would promote dances in some events that would support the radio program. So the other part was that all these radio programs, one thing that was very strong, they all had a personality. They did not represent the point of view of the owner of the station or whatever it was. They had their own. And I still remember going one time to the Portuguese consulate. At that time, they used to have meetings of the Forças Vivas, the community, which included the radio programs and the the fraternals, and was to prepare a reception for the ambassador of Portugal in Washington, was coming to visit. And they voted no, they would not receive him.
Wow. This was in the 1960s, you said.
That's correct.
Wow.
That tells you the type of personalities. You mentioned two, right there, Pisca and Morrison. Could you think anybody that didn't have? Could you think of anything that Morrison didn't have an opinion on?
Yeah. Well, yeah. and with them, I don't know if that happened in the Bay Area, and I'd like to get your perspective. But with Pisca, with Mr. Santos, and Joaquin and Amelia Morrison, there was an ongoing radio feud for
Absolutely.
years.
Joaquin Esteves and Agnello Clementine went on for years.
So there was a feud up there as well.
But that was very important. That made it important to listen, to attend, to support, that encouraged. I mean, one of the first ones, you probably don't know this, there was one between Avila and, what was the name of the other guy from Oakland, I forgot the name is now. They had a debate. The people from each radio used to have different colors, like the society, and they had a debate at the Kaiser Convention Center, and they filled the Kaiser Convention Center because they wanted to say to each other things they couldn't say on the radio, even though they were not unfriendly as you would think, but he was part of the show, and the rest is history.
Sure. Yeah, it was.
Because what these radio programs had were the personalities of these people. None of them were quote unquote educated people. They immigrated. If they had the fourth grade, that was about all they could. What they had was initiative. And the entrepreneurship that they have just made them shine.
Right. And if we look at the Portuguese radio of the 60s and 70s, do you think that, and I'm also the idea that they built community. In other words, they may have had their feuds, they may have had, whether it be for show or for some very different points of view on different things. But in the long run, these folks, Agnello Clementine, Joaquin Esteves, the Morrisons, the Avilas, etc. I think they were responsible for building the community that we have today. They were able to continue a legacy that if the radio didn't exist, I think people would have got lost in the American melting pot.
Yes. They built the community in two ways. Number one is they provided the support, economic, that allowed the new immigrants to start business. Because why would you go buy a house from a real estate you couldn't understand, but you would go from the Portuguese guy? Besides, we also think that just because the guy is Portuguese is going to give you a better deal, right? The old story. So we have all these businesses that were generated. Number two is, became the need for new organizations like the Philharmonicas, Schutzwohl, and without the radio supporting, telling what the results and the dances and the bingo games, even the programs of Portuguese, teaching in the schools. I still remember us promoting, I was out of radio already, but the bingo games and all that to pay the sister to teach the Portuguese at San Jose State. It was the same radio programs that were able to collect, in today's dollars, more than $1 million to send to Fayal for Kapling. Or even during when it was the big earthquake also in Saint George, was on radio. We were on the air when we found out, we said there's an earthquake in Saint George. In 30 minutes, we had $30,000, which in today's money is about 200,000.
There were literally millions probably collected throughout the 60s, 70s, and even into the beginning of the 80s of the different subscrições, as they were called. Would you say that many churches and chapels were redone with money from the immigrants that were collected by the radio? They were sent back to Portugal.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Churches, the Casa dos Goiatos, and I remember many of them we took to help people they were very sick and couldn't pay for the operation. And we would send a couple $1,000 to pay for them to go to the doctors. The Sisters of St. Christ, every year we had a huge subscription for them.
José, of course, radio changed when the radio stations, appeared, both up there and down here, and these strong radio personalities of the 60s and 70s did not exist in the 1980s. There was some professionalization with José João Encarnação when he came over, and of course, but it became a lot less personal.
Yes, that's it. The preoccupation, I think that the preoccupation with the professionalization, let's call it that, because it was better quality, we traded the independence and the personalities, the strong personalities and the drive. So they became employees and they would say exactly what the owner would say, you have to say, regardless, they could say it. And the radio stations also did not evolve. When I remember when I first came to the United States, it was very big to part of the program to have Cantigas ao Desafio. Later on, maybe the best thing was Antônio Mourão, O Tempo Volta para Trás.
Yeah.
And it kept going. Today, if I drive around, I listen to a lot of Portuguese, Pimba music, but there's nothing interesting that I hear that would make me come back and listen the next day, because we had news from every, for example, even though we were doing the program at that time from daily from a radio station in San Francisco, that it was an FM station with 180,000 watts.
Wow.
It covered from, I think today it's owned by KMPX. It covered from Sacramento to almost Tulare. But we did all the arrivals, the baptisms, the deaths, the weddings. So you would listen. In addition to that, it was the jobs. You must remember that people arrived from the old country. Oh, let's listen to Joaquim Morrison. Oh, there's uma leteria em tal fulano, precisa dos homens. And that's how people found their way to the jobs, to whatever they needed.
Yeah, Miguel Kenti Castro told me in a similar conversation I had with him that if he had just $1 for every job he announced, he probably would have done well.
Oh, absolutely.
Not the last 59 years, he said.
Absolutely. And things just evolved the need. For example, it was through the radio that we came to have the driver's license in California in Portuguese. I mean, Frank Diaz and I were the
Tell us
first
that
ones.
story. Tell us that story, please.
Well, Frank Diaz and I were the first. He was working for the department, and we spoke it. And I said, "Can we translate it?" We started playing with it, and then we were able to convince the 2 million Diaz and others to do the final. And now you can take your license in Portuguese and the other language now. But it generated because people were calling in the radio program and say, how do I do it? Where can I do it? Some people would help, but it was that feedback. There was a complete loop. It was not just you listen and you don't care about it. People were attached to it. There was the newspaper at that time, even though it's very different. Not the critic, because he does the newspaper the way he wants to, but if today you go to the J. Ferris Library and you decide to research the community in 1940, you take Jornal Português and you get a good picture. Because
Indeed.
The news, well, that's what the radio programs did. There was very long in birthdays, in this and that. So people had a tie-in. It was like, maybe it was the old, the new Facebook is the old Portuguese radio program.
Yeah, it was, but there were definitely cultural icons. One of my concerns, and I think that, I know that you've done a lot of research on this. I know, of course, we have Dr. Eduardo Maion Dias, who did a lot of research on the Portuguese radio, especially the first part. I think that Dr. Fernando Silva had done some research as well on the Portuguese radio. How are we going to preserve this history?
Are we going to preserve the history?
Of the Portuguese radio, of what you and I are talking about right now,
Yeah.
and we're recording, and this is going to be preserved at Fresno State, our conversation. But besides our conversation, how are we going to preserve this history of these cultural icons and of this importance to the community from 1920 all the way to today, but especially in that golden era, the I would say 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah. This is the $64,000 question of the things. What I find, Denise, is that I don't see that the young generation being not just very passionate about a lot of the stuff. We have these groups that appear, the young Portuguese Americans, this, that. I read the statistics, how many kids go to the Portuguese classes and graduate and all that. But what happens to them after that?
Correct.
And we need to get, that's where the future is. We need to get those people to come into the fold and learn a little more. And then later on, because now if somebody can grab a hold of all this information, they don't have to publish a book that, as you know, it's very expensive and troublesome. But now they have new technologies that people can do it. And then they can do, I don't know, whatever, to get the word out.
Are there any recordings of, for example, your uncle at all, or no? Any recordings of
yes.
Voz da Colônia Portuguesa?
I think there are, and I think the best collection of anybody would have was João Cartadeiro. He has of many programs. Okay. Of course, you talk about reel-to-reel tapes.
Sure.
Yeah. No, for example, we were doing live broadcasts of the Luso-American lunch on that time in Oakland. But because it was on Saturdays and I had no program, we used to record it and broadcast it on Monday. So some of these tapes, John was able to capture from my uncle, from others. So he has a collection, how many hours, but he does have.
I get a sense of the feel that of what you mentioned is a little bit off the topic, but it's in the collection of history of our community. I get a sense that even the young Portuguese Americans that are involved in the community, and we have a few of them, quite a few of them, as you know, involved in everything from the festas to the philharmonicas, to the bands, to the folklores, etc. But one of my concerns is there's a very little sense of history.
Yes. To
That
them,
we are here because somebody else did something.
yes, and they very quickly get to that. Oh, I'm Portuguese. I like linguiça and pão, and you're absolutely right. And I found that funny, also because there are some criticism, and maybe I am more receptive to that, because one person used to pick me a lot on this was Rodrigues from San Jose. Maybe you remember him, the man that ride. And it's more important what the drive is. And I think now we don't have enough of a drive of this generation and curiosity for how these things come about. I don't know how to get that induced into them, but you know very well that we're having problems with them finding officers and volunteers for the Holy Ghost and the societies and I mean the only one I see them with a lot of young people is the Philharmonicas, but part of it too is because they get fed from the music schools at the high schools.
Sure.
But the other ones are having a tough time.
Sure. And even the ones who are involved, there is this history that's been collected through the Portuguese Heritage Publication, and this history that we're talking about the Portuguese radio programs in California, especially in the 60s and 70s, and even beginning of the 1980s in some areas. It's something that if we ask young Portuguese Americans, they have no idea that these even existed.
No, but like you were in the meeting, I believe, a Portuguese Heritage Publications meeting in San Jose one time when we had a group come in for something, and the question was asked if they had got the book, and this kid so proudly, and he's very big in the community, I'm going to say the name, said, "Oh, I don't read books."
Right.
So you kind of say, well, okay, so where do we go from here?
That's true, yeah. Not encouraging words for a publishing company.
Absolutely not. You know what I mean? So,
well, José, thank you so much for your time. I wanted to get your final thoughts on today. Of course, the radio programs are almost non-existent. They are professional, quote unquote, professional radio stations. But even then, on our first, for example, our first segment that we did, we had as a guest a lady, a Portuguese American who lives in New Bedford, Massachusetts, who is the co-owner, her and her husband, of WJFD, which is the biggest Portuguese radio station, 50,000 watts FM, pretty big deal, all the way through Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. But she was telling me that it's a romantic project. She would be making much more money if the radio station was in English. And so, it's a different time, of course, these new technologies, but do you have any idea how we bring community together without the knowing its history and without some of the structures that were set up at one time?
Yeah, my thinking is bilingual. I think that's the only solution. And I mentioned that to José Avila. It makes no sense to have a newspaper only in Portuguese, because right there. And you could have the paper with the same Portuguese you have now and add on features that would make your children interested, short, sweet, and I think that's what the radio got to go the same way, because if I select good music, Portuguese music, not the same pimba pimba, they are with the accordion guy. if I select it and I explain it and the person, let's face it, you might recall this, Amalia was of a capacity that she was on American television with Ed Sullivan. So was Wolfayom Acadêmico Coimbra.
Right.
So we talk about people that have a level of professionalism, and so they could bridge a lot of this, but we got to go bilingual. We cannot force feed from the Portuguese because there's not enough people coming in. And I think the newspaper would be the easiest one to do.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thank you for the work you're doing. And
thank you.
If there's any way I can collaborate and help or indicate other people you're looking for, let me know. And good luck with the project.
Thank you so much.